History Lab studio.
If you've been in a bookshop lately, especially one at an airport, you'll know that military histories are probably Australia's most popular history books. At their best, histories of war speak to our most primal human concerns. They investigate how people felt and acted in extraordinary circumstances. And they invite us to wonder how we might respond in the same situation. But they also make us ask, why are humans so violent to each other? And how do nations and societies deal with the terrible long-term legacies and costs of war? Welcome to Field Notes, a special History Lab series. I'm your host, Michelle Arrow. Over 5 episodes, we're bringing you conversations between historians, each pair in a different field of study. You'll hear about the passions that drive their work, the questions that animate their thinking, and the ways that their fields have changed the ways that we think about the past. This episode is a conversation between Maggie Hutchison. This episode is a conversation between Maggie Hutchison from UNSW Canberra and Tom Rogers from the Military History section of the Australian War Memorial. Tom and Maggie chat about how they were drawn into military history, the divide between battle analysts and cultural historians in their field, and the always thorny questions around how Australians remember our history of war, especially the wars that we choose not to commemorate.
So Tom, what attracted you to military history?
So military history is a funny one because a lot of my interests and so on have sort of skirted around it for a long time. When I was a little kid, I was really into medieval Lego, and that was probably an intro to military history that I didn't know was happening. But the thing that really got me in was Wolfenstein 3D, which I believe was the first 3D shoot-'em-up type computer game, which I started playing when I was 7, and which my dad regretted giving to me when I was 7 because it's not for 7-year-olds, but I had a lot of fun. And when I went to the school library as a year 2 kid, I then borrowed a book about the Second World War, and I realized that these Nazis that I was fighting in Wolfenstein were real historical people. And so that was really how I learnt about it, via the Second World War, via Wolfenstein.
Yeah, mine is way less cool than that, way less fun. I got into the First World War, I think, through the poets. So Miss Joseph's Year 11 class, we had to do a speech on Wilfred Owen, Sigrid Sassoon, that kind of thing. And I think I was really fascinated by the fact that, you know, something as horrifying and destructive as the First World War was captured in this really beautiful, creative poetry. I also didn't hurt that I did really well in that speech.
Yeah.
But that's how I got into the war history, I think. So, yeah.
Right. And then, there's a link there between that and the artists that you looked at in your PhD.
Yeah, so I think that's I went into honours first. So my honours thesis was on art and war, and then, building on that for my PhD. So looking at, why artists, why would they send them to the front to capture war? You know, it seems really sort of a strange thing to do, like have artists sort of sitting in the field sketching as things are being blown up and things like that. So, that was sort of my entry into military history.
Yeah. I did my honours on the Rum Rebellion, which I suppose in one sense is military history because it's a military coup. It's the only military coup so far that we've had in Australia in 1808. But I didn't really look at military aspects of it. I was looking at how people asserted power and authority. That was what I was really looking at. But you can't look at that without thinking about the Royal Navy at that time because Governor Bligh, who was overthrown in the coup, was a Navy officer. And had famously already suffered a mutiny on the Bounty when the Rum Rebellion took place. So it was kind of easy to pin the blame for the coup on him, which was probably not fair, but that's what they did. And then when I went to my PhD, I looked at the early settlement of Port Phillip, and there's a lot of conflict there, but it's not necessarily military conflict. But one of the things that I discovered as I was uncovering these stories of conflict, which are typically between settlers and Aboriginal people. So in modern parlance, you might say civilian-led conflict and massacres and so on. When I looked into it, though, there was more military than I expected. And this time it was the British Army rather than the Navy. And so that was something that I really focused on in my thesis in one of the chapters that I don't think anyone had really looked at in the Victorian sense before. But it's good to see people like Stephen Gapps looking at it in the New South Wales context and tracing those army links, British army links, through the settler population.
I think that's an interesting point, though, like what is a military historian? Because both you and I think the elephant in the room is that we're probably cultural historians or would identify as cultural historians.
Very much so.
Yeah. And I think that's, that interesting question about like what is military history?
What is it? And do we still sort of go down those early kind of, I suppose, stereotypes about a military historian studies battles? They study what a platoon does in a battle, what a battalion does, whether the artillery came in at the right time or the wrong time, whether Napoleon deployed his artillery incorrectly or that sort of thing, which I don't think a lot of military historians are doing as much of these days.
No. I mean, because military history, I think, traditionally is seen as like war and warfare, but actually it's also the study of militaries at peace, how they interact with politics, economics, so like society, culture, all that kind of thing. So, I think that it's a very broad church.
Yeah, it is a very broad church. And I suppose, too, for me, I came to it via what was then a kind of emerging sub-discipline of histories of violence, which was something that was very influential to me when I was studying my PhD. And I taught a subject at Melbourne Uni called A History of Violence, I think 3 years in a row, which was a fascinating look at war and conflict and people killing each other, but also crime and interpersonal violence and other forms of violence. So for me, it's always been a sort of subset. Military or war has always been a subset of the broader question of why are humans so violent to each other?
Yeah.
Which I think is sort of at the heart of war studies too. Why do we keep going to war? Why does every society have rules around how we conduct wars? And is studying them worthwhile? Does it help to prevent war? I suppose is the kind of core question.
Yeah. Well, I think that brings us to the strengths and weaknesses of the discipline or the subfield.
I think for Australian military history particularly, one of the strengths is that because Australia has been such a literate society, even in the colonial period, there is so much textual primary source material that can be dug through. And you can just spend hours, as I'm sure we both have done, just going through archival records and finding all sorts of things that you don't necessarily learn when you read the history books because you can't fit every detail into a book. So I think a strength of Australian military history is the ability to do those personal stories because a lot of what we have relates to actually individuals and their experiences of war, especially in the 20th century. So that to me is a big strength. And that's something that I think the War Memorial where I work is really, that's one of the core sort of projects of the War Memorial is to get those personal stories out to the public via galleries or publications or, media and so on.
I think that is one of the big strengths of like that personal connection. People find war compelling. It's always a good narrative.
Yeah.
But also like trying to understand, like going back to what you were saying before about like these are extraordinary circumstances that people find themselves in and people want to know like how do people feel? What was it like? How did they act?
That's right. Yeah.
Actually, one of my best archival finds was I was doing that exhibition Love and War as part of the Australian War Memorial's summer scholarship and we had to look at love letters.
That's right.
And that was that really personal connection. And I remember opening up this one letter from, I think it was North Africa. This guy had sent it back and I was the first person to open it.
Wow.
Yeah. And all this sand fell out. And I was just like, I don't know if it was from the desert or not, but it seemed to me at that moment it was.
Yeah.
But that was like that kind of bringing back to that really tangible moment of history, that personal connection of like someone sent this from war back home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it hadn't been opened by the recipient?
No.
Oh, wow.
I know. I was a bit sad about that.
Yeah, that is sad. Wow.
What about the weaknesses of the discipline? Because I think we get a bit of, we're a discipline or a subfield that's defined by some of our weakest examples. And I'm thinking here of like airport kind of military history that kind of gets us.
There's a lot of that,
nationalistic, simplistic,
And I think the thing that really kills me about those, let's say airport novels, they're almost novels, is the Australians aren't fighting anyone. They lay down their lives. They sacrifice themselves. Whereas one of the things that I learned when I first got to the memorial, the former head of history there was Ashley Eakins, and he said, you're not to use any passive voice at all. So you can't say 6 men were killed. You have to say artillery fire killed 6 Australians or something like that, all active voice. And that really changes the way you think about war because it makes it intentional. And so for me, that's one of the things that bothers me about one of the tropes of Australian military history is that people go to North Africa, say, or Gallipoli, and then they lay down their lives, or they sacrifice themselves for their friends, or whatever it is, when the reality is very different. They were machine gunned by Germans or whatever it is. How about yourself? What are the weaknesses of the field?
I mean, yeah, the simplistic, over-nationalistic kind of, airport novel, as you say. But I think one of the things is that it's not, we don't want to overemphasize this, but it can be quite siloed between the kind of traditional military operational history and the theorists, more of the kind of gender history, memory, trauma studies. And so I think bringing those together is kind of important. Yeah.
Definitely. I think some of the strongest, military history works that I've read have brought together those two strands very nicely. They understand the field enough to be a specialist in military or a battle analysis or something, but they also understand all of these interventions that have happened since middle of the 20th century into the field of history generally. So given the weaknesses of military history, why is it so popular?
I think it's a great narrative. War falls into that great narrative. It's really compelling to read. I think also people have a strong connection, usually a family connection. I know myself. Grew up hearing about my great-grandfather who served in Gallipoli and in the Somme, on the Somme. And so I think there is that really strong family connection. It's a big part of war history is family history. Digitisation. So the NAA's digitisation project of First World War service records during the centenary was really important, and I think made it more accessible for people doing that family history. So I think that's a really that's why it's so popular, or that's one way that people have an entry into military history.
Yeah, well, again, a lot of the people who come into the War Memorial are doing genealogy, basically. But in order to do that genealogy, they have to do the historical research to understand what it meant. They might know that Great Uncle Jack or whoever fought on Gallipoli, but what does that actually mean? Why were the Australians there, and that sort of thing. So a lot of their work, they can access, as you say, the digitised records at home, but they come into the War Memorial to try to understand the broader context, what was going on.
Like every kind of First World War historian, I rode the centenary wave.
Yeah.
People seemed naturally interested in the First World War then. I think, we've got commemorative fatigue now, and that's really, it's very clear in the kind of interest in military history. I think it sort of faded quite quickly after 2015. But I guess with my work, I am interested in tracing public interest. So looking at why people are still keen to go to Anzac Day and commemorate on the 25th of April. But also, I guess with academic history, we're trying to also refocus that interest a little bit. So with some of my recent projects, one on veteran suicide, trying to shift that focus and public interest at looking at really important issues, not just in terms of what happens during war and kind of war history, but the long-term legacies and costs of conflict and on people who are returning. And it's a huge problem in contemporary Australia.
Yeah.
And so making sure that it's not just these kind of narratives of war, but it's also looking at, those long-term legacies. How does war actually impact Australian society?
Yeah. What happens when people come home?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Should we move on to the big thing in military history, the controversies?
Let's do it. Let's talk about the controversies. I think for me, but this is going to be obvious because I did so much study in the 19th century, for me, the Australian frontier wars have always been controversial. And it was always a point of interest to me, even before I worked at the War Memorial, this question of whether they quote unquote belong at the Australian War Memorial. And what that also means, does that mean a gallery display in the museum of the memorial, or is there a way to commemorate them as well? Because the memorial is a shrine to commemoration. It is a gallery it's a museum, but it's also an archive and a repository of a whole lot of material. So is it, when people say, the War Memorial should quote unquote do the frontier wars, what does that actually mean? Or what does that actually look like in terms of those three functions of the memorial? And in some ways, putting a display on in the gallery is probably the easiest of those three functions. I think commemoration is going to be the difficult one. So the War Memorial for many years, since the 1980s, had said the frontier wars were not wars and therefore they didn't belong in the Australian War Memorial. In 2022, they reversed that decision and said the future memorial will have a space for telling the stories of Australian frontier wars. And I think the reason for that change was the outpouring of really deep historical research from about 2000 or so that actually showed both the military nature but also the warlike nature of the Australian frontier wars, at least in part, in different parts of Australia. So I think that's kind of a shout out to academic historians, because without that huge amount of work on local areas of how the frontier played out, how frontier conflict played out across Australia, and it was very different across the whole continent, without that work, there wouldn't be anything to change the memorial's mind, I suppose, or the Council of the Australian War Memorial's mind on whether or not it was warlike. So I think that's really worth pointing out, that change didn't come about because of popular opinion or anything like that. It was based on research.
I think that's actually one of the points about the frontier wars that the use of military history, because Keith Windshuttle and all the kind of what was his book called? The Fabricated Aboriginal History or something. Yeah. And then reading John Connor's rebuke of that and just the fact that he's conceptually and factually, this is completely wrong. And then sort of unpacking that using military history and the detail of military history to really show no, this weapon is not kind of oversimplified when Keith Windshuttle was saying that kind of thing. And then showing actually this is the case and using military history as, to rebuke these kind of fabricated claims that were being directed at it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, John Connor's book was one of the really earliest ones that did that, and it was really good in showing that there was tactical development on both sides of the frontier, and that was something that I suppose a cultural historian it's probably not a question that we would ask necessarily, but a military historian would ask that question: how did they fight? How did they actually do it? Which it was one of the strengths of his book, and it led to a whole lot of other people looking into what happened.
Subject-wise, we're moving on and sort of looking more at more contemporary conflicts. So Iraq and Afghanistan are becoming really important areas of focus, but also looking at wars that we haven't, or conflicts that we haven't talked about. So the Boer War, yourself and Tom Richardson as well, looking at topics that we haven't talked about before. But I think also, maybe if we think about where military history has come from, I think we've moved very, very far away from that. So you have Charles Bean, First World War kind of official histories. That's where it begins. Then you have that set move in the 70s, Bill Gamage, Broken Years, kind of that focus on social history and the face of battle. But at the same time having that command and strategy sort of trend as well, and coming out sort of mainly that's very Canberra-centric, that one. And then we got, we have the sort of third trend, which is war and society, and maybe a fourth, which is the memory boom and kind of understanding memory. But I think where we are now is really interesting crossroads. I feel like there's lots of exciting research being done. I think also we're expanding and making military history less that kind of traditional narrative of world wars, Cold War, that kind of thing. I think my own work as well is looking to be more diverse and sort of look at how are conflicts shaping Australian society today. So I'm on a project looking at visual culture from Southeast Asia and around Southeast Asia. Australia has 1.1 people of Southeast Asian descent or birth, but their voices are missing from this kind of traditional 20th century narrative. And so I think, and many of them migrated here because of war and conflict.
Yeah, of course.
And so including that and those voices and those perspectives, I think, in our history is sort of where we're going. What about the War Memorial? Where are we going there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the War Memorial, as you know, it's recently opened up a new galleries out the back, so new Anzac Hall, and that has allowed the War Memorial to put on display artifacts from those recent conflicts that you've talked about in the Middle East, especially Iraq and Afghanistan, but also to devote more time to, or more space, gallery space, to Australian peacekeeping across that long period from about 1947 onwards, I think, which continues up to the present. So there is that just in terms of floor space, there's a lot more that's going on that relates to wars that are neither the Cold War nor the World Wars. There's also, I think, a move towards commemoration as well, or a move towards thinking about different ways of commemorating different stories. So whereas previously people who were awarded the Victoria Cross, for example, have a gallery, the Hall of Valour, for that, there are now questions about, well, how do we commemorate or remember people who didn't win a medal, but who might have also been valorous or brave or heroic in other ways or in different ways. And I think also the question of, if we do look at the World Wars, what was the experience of the Australian home front during both of those wars, which is in the galleries now, but I think more work has been done, more research has come out since those galleries were put in. And so in the future, I wouldn't be surprised if that research shapes new and different displays in those galleries on the Australian home front, especially in the Second World War.
Yeah, I think that's the war that changed Australia, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I think as well, I agree, we sort of have these old, in the War Memorial, there's this emphasis on war, obviously, and conflict, but actually those legacies are really important. Wars don't just start and end,
That's
with
right.
peace treaties. Yeah, actually, how does it shape Australian society moving forward?
Yep. Yeah, and it's such a tricky one to answer that question in a gallery.
Yeah.
That's always probably the hardest part of the gallery at the end. Well, then what? What happened after 1945? What happened after 1918? Yeah. So here's a question that I have for you.
Mm-hmm.
What are your students or members of the public always asking you? If you could wear a signboard around your neck that said one thing from Australian military history, what would it be?
I think for me, it's history and memory are different things.
Mm-hmm.
So history is a discipline with methods and practices that we use to analyse evidence, and memory is subjective. It's emotional. It's about a connection or a shared sense of the past that can't be scrutinised at all. And so I think that would be my main thing, that they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
And historians have a very, set way that we look at the past. And also I think the other thing I would say to them is that the things that we remember about Australia's military past say a lot more about the priorities of Australia in the present.
That's always a mind blower, isn't it?
Yeah.
A memorial is built and it says more about the society building that memorial than it does about the actual events that it commemorates.
Exactly, yeah. How about you?
For me, I've got a pedantic one, which is casualties does not equal fatalities, which is one that I'm always sort of saying.
That's a classic, yeah.
Yeah, it's a classic from I think all military history, not just Australian military history. But I think another one is to think about the nature of war and to just repeat the thing that any veteran will say to you, which is, if you weren't there, you don't know, which I think comes back to your question about memory and history, that there are things that can't be displayed, there are things that can't be said, probably can't be written about if you weren't there. And I think that's one of the reasons why war is compelling as a subject, because there's a fascination with something that we haven't experienced, or we've hopefully been lucky enough to not experience. So that's a key one that I think, you can do all the study you want, but at the end of the day, you're going to come just shy of the truth, which I feel that way about history generally.
I think this also comes back to the personal stories, right? It's a privilege when you get to do oral history. I think a big part of military history is oral history and learning about people's personal stories, and, veterans or people who served, sharing those experiences with you. That it's still kind of unknowable. There's that sort of language limit, but it's one of those. It's very humbling as a military historian when people share those moments with you.
It is, and it's always interesting how they put it into the context of their life as well, because they often, veterans will tell you, they won't just tell you about the war. So as the historian, it's easy to get frustrated, or I find, because I want to know, what happened on this date, what were you doing, what were you eating, what was, this and that and the other thing, what was the weather like? But they'll tell you the story of their life and fit the war into that, which is fair enough. But that's always the thing that you have to sort of deal with if you're doing an oral history, when you're trying to use that later and analyze it or use it as a historical source.
Who's influenced you as a military historian? What are your key influences?
Really, there are lots, aren't there?
Yeah.
And there are teachers who teach you. There are students when you're teaching, and students ask you amazing questions. That's one of the great things about teaching. But in terms of books, I think there are some really good ones out there. And so I'm going to call out some really weird ones that aren't Australian military history, but people might not have heard of.
Yep. Love it. Go ahead.
Got one by Evan S. Connell, who was an American author. He was an American novelist, but he wrote a history book called Son of the Morning Star, and it's all about General Custer, who was killed by Plains Indians in 1876. The reason it's worth a shout out, and it's definitely worth a read for really everyone, not just military historians, is that Connell says basically this whole story is just basically a tissue of lies, rumors, suppositions, assumptions, accusations, and he just repeats all of them. And so it's a really fun book because you get things like this guy was a raving drunk, and then the next paragraph you say, actually, he was teetotal, because we don't know. And he just reports all of these rumors and, snide remarks and so on. And yet at the end of it, you have a really good understanding of what was happening in America in 1876. Why did Custer ride in stupidly? Why did he get all of his men massacred? And what happened afterwards? But it's a really well done thing. And in a way, it's kind of humbling because it's like you actually need to be an excellent novelist to have written this book. But he also had to know his stuff, and he did a lot of primary record research to actually do the history part of it. But to tell the story, a historian wouldn't have told that story. So
that sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's an amazing book.
I haven't read it. So.
It's often at Lifeline Book Fair, so
definitely pick it up there,
pick up a coffee and give it a read because that's a great one. How about yourself? What have influenced you?
I think I remember my first book that I remember reading about war and being really influenced by it was Margaret Macmillan's Peacemakers in 1919.
Yep.
And I just remember it's a big moment in 20th century history, right? Like the Treaty of Versailles, but the conference in 1919, she describes it in such detail. So she talked about like the fashions in Paris and what they were eating.
Yeah.
And I just remember that was that moment. I think we both share a love of Greg Denning's work. And that was that moment that I realize now was that kind of giving back to the past, it's present. It was really alive.
Yep.
And I just remember thinking like these guys had agency. They're there in Paris and we know how it turns out.
Yep.
Not well.
No, it doesn't work out well.
No.
Yeah.
But at the time, there's all these decisions in front of them. There's all these possibilities and they really are living in that moment. And I just remember, I always recommend that one to my students.
Right.
I think it was written in the 90s or something. But it still has just that vibrancy of, brings history alive.
I haven't read it. I've read one of her other ones. I think it was just called War or War in the 20th Century or something. One of her recent ones. But yeah, I'll have to read that one.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah. The other one I would shout out is a naval history one because naval history often gets forgotten in military history. And this one's about the Royal Navy, and it's called The Rules of the Game by Andrew Gordon. And it's about the Battle of Jutland in the First World War, which, depending on who you ask, was a terrific victory for the Germans or a terrific victory for the British or a terrible stalemate or whatever. And he goes through and, but he starts in the 1860s and he says, who are the people who are commanding ships in 1916? Where have they come from? What's the institution that they've come from? And he's a real rivet counter. Like he knows everything about the ships, the guns, all of that stuff, all of those sort of stereotypes of naval historians. But at the same time, he's really doing a cultural and social history of the Royal Navy and looking at how they fought and why they failed, where they failed, and why they succeeded, where they succeeded. And it's really fascinating. And again, it's a lot of fun because he repeats all these lies and, snide remarks that the various officers were making about each other. So that's another one that I would recommend.
I think that's a good example as well of the potential of military history, right? Like good military history is just good history.
Yeah.
Like
definitely.
You can be writing about a campaign or something, but if you have to include all that kind of like the social stuff. And it's well-rounded, rich history. I think just sort of thinking on like that potential for military history and where we're going in the future or sort of good examples of it. I hope it's not too sycophantic because Joan Beaumont was my PhD supervisor. But Broken Nation, I think is a really good example of that kind of element of bringing all these kind of strands of military history together. So you have that dialogue between home front and battlefront and the fact that you can't really understand each without sort of understanding that interaction between both sides and both parts. Like the conscription debates, for example, in Australia.
Yeah.
How can you understand those without understanding the fact they occur against this backdrop of enormous losses in the First World War? Yeah.
it's incredible that no one had done that before. I was reading it the other day I had to give a lecture on the First World War, and I was just thinking it's incredible that it took us until 2012 or 2013, whenever it was published, to make those connections, because it seems so obvious. It's one of those great history books where it seems so obvious when you read it, but no one had said it before.
I know, and I hope that's where we're going as well. And I think that divide between like the operational and the social cultural historians, hopefully that's where we're moving to.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully, happy union of the two.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, Tom, what's the future of your research?
That is a very good question. And like most historians, I think I have a whole lot of things on the go that may never turn into anything. But I think something that will turn into something is looking at letters from Australian soldiers who were fighting in the South African War, the Boer War, looking at the letters that were published in newspapers, and there are thousands of them, much like in the First World War, and trying to ask questions about the society that they were writing to as much as what they were getting up to in South Africa. So again, coming back to that union between the social history or the home front and the actual operational history, that's what I'm in the very early stages of doing at the moment. Yeah, that's one of my projects. But how about yourself?
Well, the future of my research is basically continuing what I'm doing at the moment, but I'm working on a collaborative project on veteran suicide. So that's really interdisciplinary. So it's bringing history into conversation with sociologists and really trying to work out kind of these big questions about the cost of service. And it's like yourself, like it really does, you do need to understand what happens during these wars, what people experience in combat or just in service, and then couple that with their sort of post-war life. And so the big moment, and that's what's really important, I think, for history to be in that conversation, is looking at that transition moment. So across the last century, we've done it pretty badly. Transitioning from First World War, out into civilian society, and then like up until very recently, like we still don't do that very well.
Right.
And so trying to make sure that that's actually something that, and like you said before, like influencing policy, actually bringing history to talk about and into like conversation with contemporary issues, I think is hopefully where the future of history, not just military history, is going.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
Thanks to Maggie and Tom for being our guests today. If you'd like to read more of their work, Maggie has a chapter in the new book, Challenging Anzac, Stories That Don't Fit the Legend. And you can read Tom on displaying frontier violence in the War Memorial in the book Memory in Place, Locating Colonial Histories and Commemoration. You can find links to these and more information about the histories mentioned in this episode in the show notes. The next episode of Field Notes looks at Chinese Australian history. Field Notes is brought to you by the Australian Historical Association. You can learn more about us by visiting our website, theaha.org.au. History Lab is an Impact Studios podcast made on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Field Notes was recorded and edited by Lachlan Accord.